Conversation. It is your host, Adrienne Lawrence. And as many of you know, we are coming off of the nation's third public hearing conducted by the 1-6 committee. That is that House Congressional Committee that has been convened to investigate the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. And the results of all three hearings have so far been eye-opening. But let's get into the revelations of really what they mean. And here to help us with that is Grace Panetta. She is a senior politics reporter at Insider, and she particularly focuses on election administration and voting rights. Thank you so much for joining us, Grace.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, so first, we recently learned that Donald Trump was directly involved in a scheme to put forward those fake electors in states won by Joe Biden, and that the Republican National Committee really joined in helping Trump arrange these slates of electors. So for those of us who didn't watch, really, to what extent did we learn that Trump was involved?
Yes, we learned a lot of new information today about how high up this plot to compose these phony slates of electors went, right? It wasn't just Rudy Giuliani or John Eastman or these fringe figures. It was Trump on the phone with the chairwoman of the RNC, Ronna McDaniel, talking about it. The Trump campaign apparently wanting someone to fly the fake Wisconsin slates of electors to DC. An aide to a Wisconsin senator texting an aide to Mike Pence on January 6th, asking to transmit these fake electors that had no weight whatsoever in law. So we really did learn new information about how far up it went.
Gosh, it does sound like this has been eye-opening for a number of Americans, but unfortunately, I don't necessarily know that it convinced a lot of them, but that's my own personal opinion. But I do know that we have learned a considerable amount of information in terms of who was in this conspiracy really to overthrow democracy. And one of the other things we learned is that the 1-6 committee, what they did is they revealed that the GOP Speaker of the House in Arizona testified that he did not want to be used as a pawn by President Trump. And as a result, he backed out, refusing at least two pleas that were presented by the president. The Arizona Speaker, Rusty Bowers is his name, well, he said that you are asking me to do something against my oath, and I will not break my oath. Do you think that this type of response from these state electors or these state individuals who were in charge and really charged with overseeing the process, that this was the anomaly, or do you think this was the majority?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. And I think the important distinction, though, is who was sort of a crucial voice or a crucial force against this plot to subvert the election. I think it was, in terms of elected officials, it was the majority of elected officials in these states, but the minority was very, very vocal. What was important was the clarity with which Speaker Bowers spoke, saying, this is my oath to the Constitution, this is my duty. And then the Georgia officials talking about, here are the numbers, here are the facts. So I think that clarity from those people in those key positions is what matters at the end of the day.
Absolutely. It seems to be something that maybe a number of people in those states, particularly, that they will find to be persuasive. But this is something that I think that a lot of people who did not trust Trump to begin with could easily see him have engaged in. And I think it was good to hear it from these leaders in the GOP, especially at the state level. And one of the third things we learned is that the committee really seemed to stress that Trump didn't have any evidence whatsoever when it came to the widespread election fraud allegation and claims that he and his cronies really pushed. And at least Rudy Giuliani himself admitted that very fact based on the testimony that we heard. How do you think that this information is really resonating when it comes to the American people who may have initially believed the big lie?
Well, it's tough to say what effect the hearings are having so far, but I think, if nothing else, if this doesn't change people's minds, maybe nothing else will. I also think, people hear what they want to hear. Maybe not everyone whose mind could be changed is maybe watching the hearing. So it's hard to say what impact it's having, but the information is being laid out in a really clear and also a really compelling to watch manner by the committee. So if this more than anything could have the power to do that, but it's too early to say.
Yeah, and something that I think hopefully may possibly be redeeming is I see some polls initially, and when I wake up and open Twitter, they seem to be more indicative of people wanting to see prosecution for Trump and his cronies, which is cool, in that they want to actually see what is indicia of a democratic society. actually coming into play, where people uphold laws and people hold people accountable for their behavior. And so hopefully more of that will be the case, because that's something that at least I myself would like to see. Because hey, if we say we're a nation of laws, I'd love to see those laws actually implemented and enforced. But again, may just be me. But another one of the things we saw was about people who saw the video of election officials and workers testifying. They testified to facing death threats, severe harassment due to the big lie. There was a woman named Gabrielle Sterling. She is a Georgia election official, for example, and she testified about the threats that she faced. Yet Trump and his cronies, knowing of these things, they didn't care. They continued to push it. And I really never myself believed that Trump cared in particular, and he never seemed to be really a very empathetic person at all. So it's no shock to me. But do you think that knowing this in any way maybe will impact how people see him?
Yeah, the testimony from the two election workers who testified, or the one who testified in person, Shay Moss, and her mother, Ruby Freeman, some of whose testimony we saw on video, it was really important because it shows the impact on rank and file election workers. Figures like Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, Gabe Sterling, his deputy, they became sort of nationally lauded, heroic figures. But these lower level rank and file officials who had their lives ruined, really kind of got left behind. So it was important to hear from them.
Indeed, and hearing their voice is something that we needed to hear, because these individuals are public servants as well, and they ensure that democracy is put into place. And so, as far as I'm concerned, from the voices that I heard, I was especially proud, especially from members of the GOP, because it seems that so many of them found it so easy to go ahead and bolster the lie, to continue with it, to uplift someone who is trying to, really undermine our democracy, and if anything, push a coup. But I will also note, and I think you noted Brad Raffensperger, Georgia Secretary of State, Board of Electors. Well, it really seemed that he and his family are also on the receiving end of a lot of threats and very crude, inappropriate forms of harassment. And that's very scary, because what he is doing seems that he is standing up for democracy and doing what is right. And that should be the baseline level, but unfortunately it seems to be something that is quite heroic nowadays. And so knowing that his testimony is coming up, or is something that we expect in time, what do you expect from that?
Well, Raffensperger, when he testified before the committee today, he's an engineer by trade, so he's always very clear-eyed. He's, having specific numbers at the ready, specific facts at the ready to go. And, like you mentioned too, with the threats, he is a figure who was not very well known before 2020, but was thrust into the spotlight and could really speak to these things with a lot of power and clarity.
And how do you think that his testimony resonated?
I mean, I think to him and Gabe Sterling too, just laying out so clearly the facts, and they've had so much practice debunking all of these lies. I think it will resonate, and both with the clarity that he laid out about the threats he's faced too. I think that sends a powerful message.
Absolutely. And do you think that there was anything particularly eye-opening about what he shared? Because as the committee had noted, there were a lot of people who were completely comfortable pushing the Fifth Amendment. They were completely comfortable saying they didn't know. And yet you would like to hope that an individual who came out in the initial stages without necessarily needing a subpoena to do so, that he would have been very forthcoming. So can you, I guess, give us a succinct version of what he said and what he shared?
Yeah, he shared that the 2020 election in Georgia was not stolen. Rank and file election workers at the county level, like Shay Moss, like Ruby Freeman, they did their jobs, performed them well, and that Trump and his allies' lies were lies. And they were falsehoods and not based in anything accurate, and they had an immense amount of damage towards people. And they weren't successful in overturning the election, but they left a lot of damage in their wake, I think was the message.
Yes, and that definitely seems to be something that can be quite insightful, especially at this time. And we know that the 1-6 committee will continue in what it's doing, but unfortunately, it's running into a number of hurdles. One noting, at least yesterday, that more than 30 witnesses really refused to cooperate with the investigation. And this really does seem to bring into a different perspective the DOJ's refusal to prosecute Mark Meadows and Steve Chavino. for defying congressional subpoenas, which are simply a misdemeanor. Does it change your outlook at all to find out that 30 witnesses essentially wouldn't cooperate?
I think, yeah, Liz Cheney was definitely making a powerful point in noting that 2 regular people, rank and file election workers, showed up to testify, but all of these extremely powerful people, former Trump officials, did not. And I think that raises the stakes too for Thursday's hearing, which is about Trump's efforts to manipulate the Department of Justice towards his end. And she sort of set it up a little bit by talking about former White House counsel Pat Cipollone and how she wants him to testify. So definitely setting that up.
Yes, and that's something that we definitely need more of in terms of high-ranking people being willing to be exactly who they are behind the curtain as well as in front of it. Because we do understand that these individuals have risen in the rank and thus they see that there is a lot to potentially lose on their behalf. But at the same time, a lot of us have democracy to lose. And a number of us weren't necessarily winning to begin with. And so it could become even worse. And knowing that Trump fully probably plans to rerun again in 2024 is very scary for a number of us. So actually having people who are in positions of power using their voice to speak truth can be game changing. And so I definitely hope that they change the game. But for those out there who want to follow more of what you do, where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Grace_Panetta. That's Panetta. And you can find my articles on businessinsider.com.
Fantastic. That's Grace Panetta, senior politics reporter at Insider, with that particular focus on elections administration and voting rights. So thank you so much for joining us, Grace.
Thank you for having me.